Hi everybody, in this video I want to provide an overview of some ideas about content literacy and multilingual learners, also known as English learners or English language learners. I should point out, I think there's sometimes confusion about this terminology and the three things mean the same. For all practical purposes, there are sort of political implications behind them, and political is too strong a term, but in my opinion, they mean the same thing. Multilingual learner, English language learner, English learner, same idea. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that all students are learning English. We are all learning our languages, even though even if we are a native language speaker, we are still learning that language. We are still learning new things about it. And that's especially true, of course, in K-12. So certainly, yes, your ninth graders are still learning more things about reading and writing in English, particularly in your content areas. But here we're talking specifically about students for whom English is not their home language. And so I talk about this in some other presentations as well in the course. I have added this just to reinforce some of the standards that this course meets for prospective teacher for teacher candidates. First of all, let's talk about home languages. There are many, many, many home languages spoken in Minnesota and throughout the country. Obviously, the most common home language other than English is Spanish, but that varies dramatically from location to location, and sometimes it may surprise you. There are different lists out there of sort of the top 10 most commonly spoken home languages that I've seen over the years. I also talk about this in ED 3780. And so I've looked at this off and on throughout the years. And those lists differ, but they include often languages like Arabic, Ge'ez, which I'm sure I'm saying wrong, Amharic and other languages of Ethiopia and East Africa, Swahili, Haitian Creole, Russian, Mandarin, Korean, Hmong, Karen, which is another Southeast Asian language, Vietnamese, many others. So, although Spanish is the most common by far, and you're probably, if you're going to have a student who's a multilingual learner, the odds are highest it's going to be a student who speaks Spanish at home. It is by no means the only possibility out there. And I know that those of you who teach in the metro area are really probably well aware of that in most schools. It varies so much, and it can vary within a school. It can vary within a district and so on. So as you're working with students who have home languages other than English, there's a bunch of things to keep in mind, but the most important is, of course, that knowing additional languages for the student, that is a strength. It is not a weakness. It is it's we shouldn't approach it as, oh my goodness, it is a problem that Felicia doesn't speak proficient English yet. Now, that doesn't mean we should ignore that fact, right? We need to make sure that Felicia gets to where she needs to be successful in society, and fluency in the dominant language is necessary. And in fact, schools in the past that have um, sort of gone, not really done bilingual ed, but have taught students only in their home language and haven't been concerned with teaching English, have gotten in trouble um, with parents who say one of the things we want our children to learn when they are in school is English. So obviously, knowing additional languages is an asset. So your students who speak Spanish at home, who speak Vietnamese at home, who speak multiple languages sometimes at home, those are assets. Those are great things. Obviously, we want to respect home languages. We also want to allow our students to use them when appropriate. And sometimes it may not be appropriate to use a home language. Sometimes a student might need to use English for a specific reason. But it should be appropriate for students to discuss in their home language at times, for students potentially even to write in their home language, especially if it's something they're writing for themselves. That can be troublesome, and at times it can be a little scary. I had a good friend who was herself as a child spoke Spanish at home in South Texas and was first a Spanish teacher. That's why I first met her. She was the Spanish teacher in my middle school, and then she became the English for speakers of other languages, is what Kansas calls it, ESOL, the ESOL facilitator for the high school that I eventually taught at. And we had lots of conversations about this, and she would get very upset, correctly so, when teachers would forbid students from speaking their home language in the classroom. She said, that's awful. That is at least borderline racist. Like, that's just terrible. And I agreed. I mean, you're right. Um, However, it was really interesting. She was fluent in Spanish, of course, but that school had a lot of different languages spoken, and the second most common behind Spanish was Vietnamese. And she was subbing in a class one day for one of the other ESOL teachers, and there was a group of Vietnamese students in that classroom, and they were talking in Vietnamese and giggling at each other. And my friend got very like defensive and self-conscious and upset, and she told me afterwards, she said, Carl, I understand now why teachers get upset when they hear kids speaking Spanish, because she said, I thought they were probably talking about me and laughing at me. And she wouldn't have thought that for a kid who spoke Spanish, because she could understand the Spanish. And of course, the kids knew she understood Spanish, so they weren't going to do that. So I completely understand that reluctance. And I think there are times and places. If you are doing a high stakes test, or even practice for a high stakes test, that's more of a it's an I know that all tests are learning opportunities, but a test that is primarily assessment and evaluation and not primarily a learning opportunity, obviously you should not have students discuss the test in their native language any more than you would have English speaking students discuss the test in English. And that's a balancing act, because it's entirely appropriate for students, and students should discuss assignments with other peers who in their home languages, if that will help them understand them. Obviously, students should discuss content with peers in their home language. That will help them understand the content. It's important to encourage our students to make connections between their languages and their experiences in them with our content instruction, as well as with English. So again, home languages aren't something to be damped down or downplayed. They're something to be celebrated. That opens up new venues of academic success, and of success in life when you know multiple languages. I also want to mention, even though it's a little bit off topic, dialect, because dialect goes with language. That same information is true for dialects other than standard US English. Dialects, of course, are differences, they are not disabilities. And just as we should accept and celebrate various home languages in our schools, so too should we accept and celebrate dialects other than the standard dialect. At the same time, just as we want all of our students to learn English, we also need all of our students to be able to speak and write in standard US English when they need to do so. And that leads me to one of my interests, which I'm going to indulge in for a minute or so, which is language versus dialect. That's actually a really hard distinction to make. Linguists, people who study language, fight about these definitions, and you will hear multiple definitions, and oftentimes the definition comes at the end of a chapter, at the end of a lot of very dense prose. One way to describe a language is a series of mutually intelligible dialects, but that's not a great definition. It also doesn't really, it ends up being circular, because a dialect is a type of a language that has a partially unique pronunciation and vocabulary and grammar rules to an extent. The problem with these definitions is that traditionally, especially historically, not so much today, I think, but certainly at one point, some dialects are not mutually intelligible. So, for example, in medieval and early modern Europe, German was, of course, widely spoken. Late medieval and early modern, the modern German, what become modern German, was widely spoken, but of course it was a series of dialects. And the German that was spoken, say, in the Alps, like in Switzerland or in Austria, was a dialect. And as you went further north, the dialect shifted. Not unusual, but by the time you got, say, to the border of Denmark, the German spoken there was so different from the German spoken in Switzerland that they were not necessarily mutually intelligible, is my understanding. Like, German is not one of my languages I have a strong background in. Um, so sometimes dialects really are mutually unintelligible. You can't understand each other's dialect. You can't understand all of it. And the opposite is also true in some conditions, or some cases. Some languages are relatively mutually intelligible. And a classic example there, and sometimes speakers of these languages get upset when this is stated, so I apologize in advance. But there is a great deal of mutual intelligibility between the continental Scandinavian languages of Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian. Now there is less mutual intelligibility with Icelandic, which is much is it comes from the same place, but because it is so far away from Europe and is on an island, it developed um, differently because it had less exposure to other languages like German, and it retained a lot of the features of Old Norse, its ancestor, all of their ancestors' language. Um, and so some linguists would argue that those three languages are really three dialects of a common Scandinavian language, but the common Scandinavian language doesn't really exist. We can't say that Danish is a dialect of Swedish, that makes no sense. We also can't say that Swedish is a dialect of Norwegian or that Norwegian is a dialect of either of the other two languages. But yet, those three languages are, at least to an extent, if you're a native speaker, um, understandable about maybe two-thirds of the time at least. I have heard that Swedish and Danish are closer to each other in terms of their histories. I'm not sure if that's true or not. I will say that Danish is really hard to understand spoken Danish um, compared to spoken Swedish and spoken Norwegian. But and then you also have the fact that those languages have a ton of dialects, despite the fact that they're very small countries. Norwegian is particularly notorious for having a zillion dialects, and there is no push in Norway to have anything like a standard Norwegian dialect. So the huge complexities here, and another two great cases are Chinese and Arabic. There is no Chinese language as such, but the various languages of China share a common writing system, the Chinese script. And the Chinese writing system, of course, is famously a pictographic system. It is a series of symbols that stand for words. It is not an alphabet like the writing system used by English and German and Hindi and Arabic and most languages in much of the world. And but because that's a standard writing system, what that means is that speakers of Mandarin Chinese, which is the largest Chinese language, and the speakers of, say, Cantonese, which is, I think, the second largest, they can't understand each other when they speak, but they can read the same writing and understand that. Another good example is Arabic. Arabic, of course, is the language of the Quran, and because the Quran is held as holy scripture um, in those countries by the vast majority of people, two types of Arabic are kind of taught. There is the I'll say standard Arabic, that might not be the right term. That is the language of the Quran that has remained, I won't say unchanged, but it would enable somebody to read the Quran, and it is very different from daily language. And the daily everyday dialect of Arabic spoken in, say, Syria versus Egypt versus Morocco are in fact very, very different from standard Arabic, to the point that they are um, kind of close to different languages, apparently. And again, I'm not an expert in Arabic either, but I learned this from my favorite linguist, John McWhorter. Um, and I wanted to share it. So I share this because when we talk about things, it's really simple and easy to say, oh, we should respect home languages or we should respect home dialects. We should make sure that we leverage those, and those are strengths for students to build on. But it's also important we understand the complexity of the ideas behind it when we talk about language and dialect. I also want to point out, which is not a slide, so you just have to listen, you should not assume that your student is literate in their home language. You may not know how long the student has been in the United States, and or if the student was educated in their home language. And so it may be possible that you have a student who speaks Spanish at home but does not read or write Spanish, or a student who speaks Arabic at home but does not read or write Arabic. And so that's important for you to keep in mind, because I often Teachers often say, "Oh, I'm going to translate this handout so it's in Spanish for my kids who speak Spanish," and that's great if your students also read Spanish, and they may or they may not, and so that's important to keep in mind. I'm not saying don't do it, but I'm saying be ready and be aware of how fluent students are in their home languages, and in some cases as well for parents. When you think about parent communication, you think, oh, I'm going to send this note home, I'm going to get translated into um, Amharic. And that's great if you can do that, but are the parents of your students, are they literate in their home language? Not everyone is. Um, so those are things to keep in mind. Thanks for watching part one. In part two, we'll talk about some ways to support and accelerate academic literacy.